The Consolidated Fidelity Life Building stood on Pearl Street like a limestone fortress, a monument to the inevitability of death and the profitability of predicting it. In Hartford, Connecticut, in the autumn of 1951, the insurance industry was not merely a business. It was the city's central nervous system, its primary religion, and its undisputed sovereign. The stone towers of the great firms defined the skyline, and the men who worked within them carried an almost ecclesiastical authority. To question the practices of a company like Consolidated Fidelity was to question the very bedrock upon which the city was built. Elliot Marsh arrived at the fourth floor at exactly 8:12 in the morning, wearing the same heavy brown wool suit he wore every Monday. He stepped off the brass-gated elevator and walked down the long, linoleum-tiled corridor toward his desk in the underwriting examination pool. The morning air in the building possessed a distinct, heavy quality. The radiator heat hissed from the iron grates beneath the tall windows, carrying the dry, dusty odor of old paper and damp wool coats, underscored by the faint, biting chemical sharpness of carbon paper rising from the typing pool 2 floors below. It was an atmosphere designed to induce a sense of permanence and order. Marsh reached his desk, hung his coat on the wooden rack, and sat down. He was a man who habitually rechecked his own arithmetic twice before accepting it, a man who kept a slide rule in his breast pocket the way other men kept a fountain pen. His life was governed by rigid, comforting routines. Within 60 seconds of sitting down, he knew they had been here. He stared at the surface of his desk. The slide rule he kept as a secondary tool, the one he always left resting on his green leather blotter at a precise 45-degree diagonal, was lying perpendicular to the desk edge. It was a minor deviation, the sort of thing a cleaning crew might do, but the cleaning crew was strictly instructed never to touch the actuary's instruments. Marsh slowly reached down and pulled open his bottom right desk drawer. The manila file tabs, which he meticulously arranged by the date of policy origination, had been reordered. They were now perfectly, uniformly alphabetical. Marsh did not gasp. His breathing did not change. He simply sat there, his hands resting flat on the desk, absorbing the absolute certainty of his situation. The company already knew he had been looking. Desmond Farwell, the senior underwriting examiner whose personnel files Marsh had accessed without authorization, must have triggered an alert. They had searched his desk in the night. Marsh stood up, his face an unreadable mask of mild concentration, and walked back down the corridor to the men's room. He pushed through the heavy oak door, locked himself in the farthest stall, and stood in the absolute quiet of the tiled space. He reached into the inside breast pocket of his brown wool suit jacket. His fingers brushed the stiff, folded edge of a piece of paper. He drew it out just far enough to confirm it was there. The folded carbon copy of his comparison table, the document he had been carrying on his person for 2 weeks. He exhaled, a slow, controlled release of breath. Whoever had searched his desk in the dark had been looking for the master ledger of his suspicions. They had not found the copy he was most afraid of losing. He slipped the paper back into his pocket, smoothed the lapels of his suit, and returned to the floor. At 8:45, before the morning bell had even rung to signal the official start of the workday, Marsh's supervisor stopped by his desk. Peterson was a mild, perpetually nervous man who wore his authority like an ill-fitting coat. "Elliot," Peterson said, his voice careful, pitched just low enough to avoid carrying to the neighboring desks. "Good morning, Arthur," Marsh replied, looking up from a blank sheet of ledger paper. "The managing director would like to see you at 11, Peterson said. Marsh watched Peterson's face. Peterson was looking at the brass lamp on Marsh's desk, then at the frosted glass of the nearest office door, then at the floor. He would not meet Marsh's eyes. In the 10 years Marsh had worked under Peterson, the man had never failed to make eye contact during a routine assignment. The evasion was a klaxon warning. The meeting was not routine. 11 o'clock, Marsh repeated, his tone perfectly level. "I will be there," Thank you, Arthur. Peterson nodded quickly to the floorboards and hurried away. Marsh had 2 hours and 15 minutes to wait. He did not pretend to work on his assigned accounts. Instead, he stood up, walked to the company library at the end of the hall, and pulled the heavy, leather-bound mortality tables for the relevant demographic. He carried the heavy volumes back to his desk and opened them in plain sight. If they knew he was looking, there was no longer any strategic value in hiding the methodology, only the conclusions. He opened his slide rule, the smooth friction of the wood a familiar comfort against his thumbs. He worked through the probability calculation step by step. He isolated the specific cohort, women over the age of 60, recently widowed, with no living dependents. He looked at the historical baseline for natural mortality within this narrowly defined group over a 14-month window. Then he factored in the anomaly he had discovered in the reinsurance reconciliation reports. 12 specific policies canceled, followed by 4 deaths among those 12 women within weeks of the cancellation. He adjusted the central slide, aligning the logarithmic scales. He checked the arithmetic. He cleared the rule and checked it a second time. The numbers did not lie, but they did not speak either. They only waited to be read. The chance of 4 deaths occurring in this specific cohort, in this specific time window, by natural causes alone, was roughly 1 in 2,000. Marsh took a freshly sharpened pencil and wrote the figure 1 to 2,000 at the very bottom of his comparison table. It was not a smoking gun, but in the language of actuarial science, it was a screaming siren. At 5 minutes to 11, Marsh gathered his suit jacket, checked that the carbon copy was secure in the breast pocket, and walked up the 2 flights of stairs to the executive floor. The office of Gerald Norcott, the managing director of Consolidated Fidelity Life, was a study in engineered intimidation. It was a large corner room draped in heavy, dark velvet curtains that absorbed the light and deadened the air. The ambient noise of Pearl Street, the rumble of delivery trucks, the honking of taxicabs, the shouts of newsboys, was entirely absent here. It was a room where the particular quality of quiet ensured that every word Norcott spoke landed without echo, heavy and final. Behind Norcott's massive mahogany desk hung a framed letter of commendation from the governor of Connecticut. Norcott was a broad-shouldered man with silvering hair and a demeanor so unhurried it bordered on glacial. He possessed the kind of supreme confidence that allowed him to let silences do his threatening for him. "Elliot," Norcott said pleasantly, gesturing to one of the leather chairs opposite the desk. "Please, sit." "Thank you, Mr. Norcott," Marsh said, sitting down. He kept his posture straight, his knees together, his hands resting on his thighs. He spoke in complete, qualified sentences, a habit that persisted even under extreme stress. Norcott opened a manila folder on his desk. Marsh recognized the color of the tabs. It was a duplicate of his own file. "I have been reviewing the analytical work you submitted 3 weeks ago," Norcott began, his voice almost sympathetic, the tone of a patient professor addressing a bright but misguided student. "It is technically competent work, Elliot. You have always been one of our most thorough examiners. However, the data shows what all actuarial data shows when you slice it narrowly enough." Norcott closed the folder and folded his large hands over it. "You have identified a cluster. The human mind is uniquely primed to see patterns where none exist. Our cancellation practices, as you well know, are reviewed quarterly by an independent auditor. Your analysis reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of portfolio-level variance." Marsh said nothing. He waited. "In a pool of our size," Norcott continued, his voice dropping a fraction of an octave into a register of absolute authority, "fluctuations in mortality among canceled policies are entirely within normal variance." Marsh counted the phrase. 1. "We cannot allow an examiner to disrupt the workflow of the underwriting department because he has become fixated on a statistical artifact that falls well within normal variance. 2. I want to assure you, Elliot, that the executive committee considers this matter closed." The numbers are within normal variance, and we expect you to return your focus to your assigned duties. 3. Norcott leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking softly in the deadened room. The sympathetic mask slipped just a fraction, revealing the cold iron beneath. On a related note, Norcott said, still pleasantly, the company is aware that you recently accessed personnel files outside your authorization grade, specifically the files of Mr. Desmond Farwell. Marsh felt a cold drop of sweat trace a line down his ribs beneath his wool suit. This is, as I am sure you are aware, a terminable offense, Norcott said. He let the silence stretch, expanding to fill the corners of the room. He let Marsh sit in the weight of his ruined career. However, Norcott finally added, given your long tenure with Consolidated Fidelity, the company has chosen, for now, not to pursue the matter formally, assuming, of course, that your focus returns entirely to your own desk. The implication was clear without being stated. Drop the investigation, ignore the dead women, and keep your job. Push further, and you will be fired, discredited, and blacklisted from every insurance firm in Hartford. Marsh stood up. He looked at the framed letter from the governor, then down at Norcott. I understand perfectly, Mr. Norcott. Thank you for your time. Have a productive afternoon, Elliot, Norcott said. Marsh returned to his desk on the 4th floor. He ate lunch alone, unwrapping a wax paper package containing a dry ham sandwich. As he chewed mechanically, he pulled a fresh sheet of paper from his drawer and made a list. He drew a line down the center. On the left side, he wrote what he had. The pattern of 12 cancellations. The demographic consistency, widows, over 60, no dependents. The probability figure, 1 to 2,000. The names of the 4 dead women. On the right side, he wrote what he did not have. Any physical connection between the cancellations and the deaths. Any evidence of payment or financial irregularity beyond the canceled premiums. Any witness. He stared at the right side of the page. The list frightened him when he saw it on paper. He was an actuary, a man of numbers, not a detective. He had deduced a murder conspiracy from the shadows it cast on a balance sheet, but he had no proof of the physical mechanism. He was entirely out of his depth, and the men who controlled his livelihood were now watching his every move. He carefully folded the list, tore it into tiny uniform squares, and dropped them into his wastebasket. At 5 o'clock, the bell rang. Marsh packed his briefcase, put on his coat, and left the building at his normal time. He walked out into the biting November air, but instead of heading toward the bus stop on Asylum Avenue, he turned north and walked 3 blocks out of his way. He found a payphone on Trumbull Street, tucked against the brick wall of a closed haberdashery. He refused to use the office telephone, knowing the switchboard operators logged outgoing calls. He stepped into the booth. The receiver was freezing against his ear, and the mouthpiece smelled faintly of someone else's stale cigarette. He dropped his coin into the slot. The mechanical click of the connection sounded loud in the enclosed space. He dialed the number for the Hartford Evening Courier. City desk, a gruff voice answered. Vivian Cross, please, Marsh said. He had contacted her 2 weeks ago through an intermediary, a former clerk who had left the company to work in the newspaper's advertising department. They had met once, briefly. She's not at her desk, the voice said. Want to leave a message? Yes, Marsh said. Tell her Elliot Marsh called. I will be at the following number in 20 minutes. He recited the number of the payphone located outside the pharmacy near his apartment building in the South End. He hung up, pulled his collar tight against the wind, and walked to the bus stop. 25 minutes later, Marsh was standing in the cold outside the pharmacy, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, watching the street lamps flicker on in the gathering dusk. The payphone rang. He snatched it off the hook before the second ring. Marsh, he said. Cross, the voice on the other end replied. Vivian Cross spoke with a rapid, unvarnished cadence that betrayed her working-class upbringing in Coltsfoot, a North End neighborhood that had no patience for the polite evasions of the corporate class. She was a reporter who kept a stenographer's notebook in each coat pocket and asked the same question 3 different ways until she got an answer she believed. Their conversation was brief and careful. Neither of them trusted the telephone lines. "I have completed the statistical analysis of the insurance industry data we discussed," Marsh said, his voice tight. "It suggests a definitive pattern of harm to a specific class of policyholders." There was a brief pause on the line. Cross did not ask how he felt or what the company had said. She asked 2 precise questions. "How many people?" 12, Marsh said. "Are any of them still alive?" Marsh closed his eyes, visualizing the pale green ledger paper in his breast pocket. "Yes." "Tomorrow morning," Cross said. 8 o'clock. The Blue Anchor Diner on Farmington Avenue. Sit in the back." "I will be there," Marsh said. "Bring every piece of paper you have," Cross instructed, her tone shifting into a commanding gear. "And Marsh, make at least 1 additional copy of everything before morning. Do not bring the only copy to the diner." She said this without explaining why, without adding any melodramatic warnings about his safety. The sheer, pragmatic instruction told Marsh everything he needed to know. She had done this before. She knew how easily a man with a briefcase full of dangerous paper could lose it. "I understand," Marsh said. The line went dead. Marsh did not go home. He walked back toward the center of the city, heading for the public library on Main Street. The library was a massive, echoing structure of marble and brass, a place where a man in a brown wool suit carrying a briefcase was entirely invisible. He went to the reference desk and requested the use of the document reproduction service. The librarian, a tired-looking woman stamping due dates into the backs of encyclopedias, did not ask what the document was. She simply pointed him toward the heavy, humming photostat machine in the corner of the reading room. Marsh took the folded carbon copy from his breast pocket. He carefully smoothed the creases. He fed the document into the machine, paying the required coins, and waited as the bright light flashed and the chemical smell of the reproduction process filled the small alcove. He made 1 perfect, high-contrast copy of the comparison table, complete with the penciled 1 to 2000 at the bottom. He placed the original back in his breast pocket. He took the fresh copy, folded it into thirds, and placed it inside a blank envelope he had purchased from the library's stationery dispenser. He left the library and walked to the post office on Asylum Avenue. He addressed the envelope to his own apartment, affixed the proper postage, and dropped it into the brass mail slot. It was a poor man's insurance policy. If he was stopped, searched, or relieved of his briefcase on the way home, the evidence would already be in the custody of the federal mail system, scheduled to arrive at his door the following afternoon. Only then did Marsh finally take the bus home. His apartment was small, impeccably clean, and entirely devoid of personal photographs or decorative flourishes. It was the apartment of a man who lived entirely within his own mind. He locked the deadbolt, hung his coat on the hook by the door, and walked into the kitchen. He turned on the single overhead bulb. The light cast harsh, sharp shadows across the linoleum floor. He sat down at the small Formica kitchen table. He reached into his breast pocket and withdrew the original comparison table. He unfolded it and smoothed it flat under the glare of the bulb. The pale green of the ruled ledger paper seemed to glow in the dim room. He looked at the columns of data, the dates of cancellation, the dates of death. His eyes tracked down to the 4 names written in his small, precise hand at the bottom of the column marked Outcome. 4 widows, 4 canceled policies, 4 sudden, natural deaths. He stood up, walked to the telephone stand in the hallway, and retrieved the heavy Hartford city directory. He brought it back to the kitchen table and opened it, flipping past the dense columns of businesses and residences until he reached the F section. He ran his finger down the page. Finch, R. He found it. Roberta Finch. Marsh took his pencil from his pocket. He looked at the comparison table. Roberta Finch was the 5th name on the list of 12 canceled policies. The first 4 were dead. The remaining 8 were in the wind. But Roberta Finch was still here. In the margin of the pale green ledger paper, right next to her name, Marsh carefully wrote down her address, Wethersfield Avenue. He stared at the name for a long time. The silence of his apartment was absolute, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the stove. He had the numbers. Tomorrow, Vivian Cross would ask him for the human reality behind them. Roberta Finch was the only name on the list still attached to a living person, and Elliot Marsh knew, with the cold, mathematical certainty of a man who understood probability better than he understood people, that her time was running out. Elliot Marsh arrived at the Blue Anchor Diner on Farmington Avenue 22 minutes before the agreed hour. He preferred to be early. It allowed him to observe the variables of a room before introducing himself into its equation. He bypassed the counter and selected the rear booth, sliding across the particular orange of the vinyl booth seats, which were cracked along the seam nearest the window. He positioned himself carefully, sitting with his back to the wall, a tactical consideration he had never before found necessary in his quiet, predictable life as an actuary. The air in the diner was heavy and close, carrying the smell of bacon grease absorbed into every surface over decades of continuous operation. It was a scent that seemed to cling to the very plaster of the walls. A waitress in a faded yellow uniform approached, and the sudden clatter of a heavy ceramic mug set down on a formica table punctuated the low, indistinct murmur of the morning crowd. Marsh ordered black coffee and waited. His hand rose instinctively to brush the lapel of his brown wool suit, his fingers seeking and finding the rigid, comforting shape of the slide rule in his breast pocket. He touched it the way other men might touch a talisman, grounding himself in the certainty of mathematics while he waited to commit professional treason. Vivian Cross arrived exactly on the hour. She did not scan the room with the tentative, wandering gaze of a stranger. She walked directly to the rear booth and slid into the cracked vinyl opposite him. She was already carrying a stenographer's notebook, its wire binding gleaming dully under the diner's fluorescent lights. She wore a dark, practical coat, and her expression was entirely devoid of the pleasantries that usually lubricated morning meetings in Hartford. Before Marsh could offer a greeting, she opened the notebook, flattened it against the formica, and began to speak. 1412 Park Street, 88 Maple Avenue, 204 Franklin Avenue. Cross recited the addresses in a flat, rhythmic cadence, her eyes fixed on Marsh rather than the page. She continued through the list, naming the streets and house numbers of all 12 canceled policyholders from memory. 71 Wethersfield Avenue, 19 Campfield Avenue. It was a deliberate demonstration of competence. She was proving, without boasting, that she had spent the previous night buried in the city property records, verifying his initial claims, and doing her own preliminary work. When she finished the 12th address, she closed the notebook and waited, her gaze challenging him to match her preparation. Marsh did not speak. He reached into the inside breast pocket of his coat, withdrew the folded carbon copy of the comparison table, and handed it across the table. Cross took the pale green ledger paper and unfolded it. For exactly 4 minutes, she studied the table without interrupting herself. Marsh watched her in silence. He observed the way her eyes tracked the columns, the dates of cancellation, the demographic markers of the widows, the dates of death for the first 4 women. She did not gasp. She did not ask for clarification on the probability calculation, 1 in 2,000, that he had penciled at the bottom of the page. She simply absorbed the mathematics of murder with the cold, analytical detachment of a journalist who had grown up in Coltsfoot and knew exactly what men in expensive suits were capable of doing to people who lacked power. Finally, she looked up. "The 4 deceased," she said, her voice dropping a register so that it would not carry beyond their booth. "Were they all attended by the same physician?" Marsh blinked. He mentally reviewed the death certificate data he had meticulously compiled over the past month. He had focused entirely on the statistical anomalies, the dates, the causes of death listed as cardiac failure or respiratory arrest, the demographic similarities. He had looked at the data as an actuary, not as an investigator. "I do not know," he said, his voice carrying the precise, qualified tone he used when admitting a gap in his data. "I have the death certificate data, but I have not looked at the attending physician field." Cross took a pencil from her pocket, leaned over the table, and drew a hard, dark circle around the column heading marked Outcome. "Find out by the end of the day," she told him. She leaned back against the vinyl, her posture shifting from investigative to instructional. "Mr. Marsh, I need you to understand something about the reality of publishing news in this city. I cannot publish a pattern of numbers alone. It does not matter that your probability calculation is 1 in 2,000. It does not matter that the demographic consistency is flawless." She spoke directly, her tone devoid of condescension but entirely unyielding. "If I take a spreadsheet to my editor, Raymond Pruitt, and accuse Consolidated Fidelity Life of systematic homicide, the company's lawyers will bury the Evening Courier in injunctions before the morning edition goes to print. They will claim statistical variance, just as your managing director did. They will say you are a disgruntled employee misinterpreting standard portfolio adjustments." Marsh felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The logic was unassailable. "Then what do you require to make the story viable?" "I need one of 3 things," Cross said, holding up her fingers to count them off. "I need a living person willing to speak on the record about the cancellation process, to prove the company is acting with malice rather than clerical error. I need a financial irregularity I can document independently, a money trail that connects the cancellations to a payout. Or, I need a medical source willing to question at least one of these death certificates. Without one of these 3 pillars, the story will not survive the legal department. A pattern is not a proof." She was direct about this in a way that was not unkind, merely factual. Marsh considered the parameters. The financial irregularity was the most logical avenue for his specific skill set. "There is an actuary in my department," Marsh said carefully, leaning forward slightly. "His name is Thomas Hedges. He was passed over for the promotion that went to Desmond Farwell. I have heard Hedges complain about Farwell in the men's room more than once. He has mentioned irregularities in Farwell's conduct." Cross narrowed her eyes, assessing the tactical value of a disgruntled employee. Professional jealousy is a powerful motivator, but it is also a massive liability. Approach Hedges carefully. Find out exactly what he knows before you say a single word about the comparison table or the deaths. If he is merely bitter about a promotion, he will trade your inquiry to Farwell in exchange for favor. Do not expose yourself. They parted ways outside the diner, stepping into the crisp morning air of Hartford. The city skyline loomed around them, defined by the stone towers of Etna, Travelers, and Hartford Fire, monuments to the industry that employed 1 in 4 residents. To question a company's practices here was to question the city's very identity. They were 2 people standing in the shadow of giants, armed with nothing but a green ledger sheet and a stenographer's notebook. For the first 2 days following their meeting, Vivian Cross walked the neighborhoods of Hartford. She moved through the working-class enclaves of the South End and the quiet, aging streets where widows maintained homes built for larger, louder families. She knocked on doors under the pretense of writing a feature for the Courier on widows' financial planning in the post-war economy. It was a solid cover story. Women who had lost husbands in the war or to post-war illness had become a demographic fixture in 1951. Respectable, quiet, and financially vulnerable. Cross sought the 8 women on Marsh's list who were still alive. She identified 3 who were still in their homes, still processing the bewildering bureaucracy of their sudden policy cancellations. 2 of them flatly refused to speak to a reporter. They were frightened, conditioned by a lifetime in the insurance capital to view the companies as infallible, paternal entities. To question a cancellation was to invite further ruin, and they closed their doors with polite, terrified finality. The third woman lived in a small, impeccably maintained house on Weathersfield Avenue. When Cross knocked on the door, the woman who answered did not look frightened. She looked irritated. Her name was Roberta Finch, and when Cross delivered her cover story about financial planning, Finch's eyes narrowed with sharp, calculating intelligence. "I don't need financial planning," Finch said, her voice crisp and carrying the authority of a woman who did not suffer fools. "I need an explanation as to why a contract I have paid into for 22 years has been unilaterally dissolved without cause." Cross recognized the opening instantly. "That is exactly the sort of institutional difficulty my feature is examining, Mrs. Finch. I would very much like to hear about your experience with the company." Finch studied her for a long moment, taking in Cross's practical coat and the notebook in her hand. She gave a curt nod. "I have errands this afternoon. Come back tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. I will show you the paperwork." While Cross walked the neighborhoods, Elliot Marsh executed his assignment within the imposing stone walls of the Consolidated Fidelity Life Building on Pearl Street. He approached Thomas Hedges over lunch in the company cafeteria. The vast room was a cavern of echoing noise, the continuous clatter of metal trays sliding along the serving rail, the low roar of hundreds of simultaneous conversations, and the heavy, pervasive smell of institutional beef stew that seemed to hang in the humid air. Marsh selected a table surrounded by empty chairs, setting his tray down with his usual meticulous care, aligning his silverware parallel to the edge of his tray. Hedges joined him shortly after, looking visibly gratified by the sudden attention from a colleague who usually ate in solitary, mathematical silence. Marsh steered the conversation toward departmental procedures, allowing a carefully calibrated note of frustration to enter his voice regarding Desmond Farwell's management style. It was all the prompting Hedges required. Leaning across the table, Hedges's voice dropped to a near whisper, his eyes darting nervously toward the cafeteria doors. "You aren't the only one who sees it, Elliot. The man is a complete fraud. I filed a formal complaint with the HR department 8 months ago." Marsh kept his expression perfectly neutral, though his pulse quickened. "A complaint regarding his underwriting decisions?" "His expenses," Hedges hissed, his face flushing with remembered indignation. "Expense irregularities. Falsified mileage for client visits he never made. Favoritism in file assignments. He hoards the high premium reviews for his own desk to inflate his quarterly metrics and secure his bonuses." I documented it all. And you know what happened? The HR department closed the complaint without a finding, swept it right under the rug. He's protected. Marsh listened as Hedges talked at length, detailing petty grievances, bureaucratic slights, and office politics. As the actuary spoke, Marsh mentally cross-referenced Hedges's complaints against the architecture of the cancellation scheme. The disappointment was cold and immediate. None of this touched the pattern. Falsified mileage and file hoarding were the mundane, pathetic sins of a middle manager, not the mechanics of a systematic culling of vulnerable policyholders. Hedges knew absolutely nothing of the demographic targeting, nothing of the deaths, nothing of the fraudulent reinsurance arrangement. Marsh carefully maintained his posture of sympathetic collegiality, ensuring he did not reveal what he was actually looking for. The lunch was a dead end. Returning to his desk on the 4th floor, Marsh retrieved his notes on the death certificates. He had pulled the raw data weeks ago, but as Cross had pointed out, he had suffered from a statistician's blindness, focusing entirely on the dates and ignoring the human variables. He ran his finger down the column marked Attending Physician. On the first certificate, Dr. Clarence Whitby. On the second certificate, Dr. Clarence Whitby. On the third certificate, Dr. Clarence Whitby. On the fourth certificate, a hospital attending physician at Hartford Hospital. Marsh stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. 3 out of 4 deaths, occurring in different neighborhoods over a span of several months, all attended by a single physician. This was the first time Whitby's name had appeared in Marsh's analysis. He took a fresh sheet of paper and wrote the name Dr. Clarence Whitby, at the top, in his small, precise script. The statistical probability of one neighborhood doctor attending 3 out of 4 randomly distributed natural deaths in this specific cohort was astronomical. It was not a coincidence. It was a mechanism. Marsh spent the entirety of the third day away from the office, utilizing his accumulated sick leave to visit the state offices on Capitol Avenue. The public records room was a monument to bureaucratic permanence, characterized by high ceilings and green-painted walls that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. The air carried the musty weight of bound licensing ledgers, and the heavy silence was broken only by the rhythmic, percussive sound of the clerk's rubber stamp hitting paper in the next room. Marsh requested the medical licensing board records for Dr. Clarence Whitby. He sat at a long, scarred oak table, turning the heavy pages of the ledgers. He found the address of Whitby's practice on Asylum Avenue. He found his listing in the city directory. And then, buried in the disciplinary annex, he found the anomaly. 2 years prior, Whitby had been the subject of a severe malpractice judgment. The details outlined a pattern of gross negligence regarding the administration of unapproved sedatives, resulting in a near loss of his medical license. The board had allowed him to retain his practice only after a humiliating probationary period and the payment of a ruinous financial penalty. Marsh read the judgment twice. Whitby was a man who had been pushed to the edge of professional and financial ruin. He was a man who needed money, and who had already demonstrated the highly flexible relationship with medical ethics. He was exactly the kind of man Gerald Norcott and Desmond Farwell would recruit. Marsh carefully copied the dates and docket numbers of the judgment. He had found the medical source. On the morning of that same third day, Vivian Cross returned to Wethersfield Avenue. Roberta Finch welcomed her into the house and led her directly to the kitchen. The room was immaculate, though the air held the sharp smell of percolated coffee gone slightly stale. On the wall beside the refrigerator hung a calendar from a local hardware store, still showing the previous month. A rare lapse in Finch's otherwise rigorous domestic order, hinting at the distraction the cancellation had caused her. Finch sat at the small table and opened a battered tin box. The crisp sound of 22-year-old policy documents unfolded from the tin filled the quiet room. Finch smoothed the heavy, watermarked paper flat against the table. 71 years old, Finch said, tapping the documents with a manicured fingernail. I was a bookkeeper for 30 years, Miss Cross. I balance my household accounts to the penny. I have never missed a premium payment. Not during the Depression, not during the war. I am not a lapse risk. She produced a newer, thinner sheet of paper and slid it across the table. 3 weeks ago, I received this. Cross read the document. It was a policy review notice, couched in the dense, impenetrable language of actuarial risk reassessment, but its conclusion was clear. Consolidated Fidelity Life was initiating the cancellation of her policy due to recalculated demographic risk factors. I wrote to them immediately, Finch said, producing a carbon copy of a handwritten letter. I demanded an itemized explanation of these risk factors. I sent it by registered mail to the customer service department. Did they reply? Cross asked, her pen flying across the pages of her stenographer's notebook, capturing every detail. Silence, Finch said, her jaw setting into a hard, unforgiving line. Absolute silence. Cross spent 90 minutes at that kitchen table. She recorded the policy numbers, the dates of correspondence, the exact phrasing of the cancellation notice. She listened to Finch detail her financial history, recognizing the woman's sharp intellect and deep suspicion of the official correspondence she could not force to make sense. Cross knew, with chilling certainty, what the silence from the company meant. Finch had been flagged by Farwell. The machinery was already in motion. Yet Cross did not tell Finch she might be in physical danger. To do so without proof would sound like lunacy, and it might cause Finch to panic and contact the police prematurely, which would instantly alert the company and allow Norcott to cover his tracks. Cross simply recorded everything in her notebook, her expression a mask of professional empathy. Cross and Marsh met on the third evening at the Blue Anchor Diner to compare notes. The dinner rush had thinned, leaving them in relative isolation in their rear booth. They spoke in low voices, the diner's ambient noise covering their conversation. "Finch is cooperative," Cross reported, flipping through her notebook. "She has the original policy documents, the cancellation notice, and proof of an unanswered inquiry. She is sharp, Marsh. She will make an excellent witness on the record." Marsh nodded, pulling his own notes from his breast pocket. "I have the physician, Dr. Clarence Whitby. He signed 3 of the 4 death certificates, and he has a disciplinary history." Marsh detailed the malpractice judgment, the near loss of the license, the financial desperation. "He's the weakest link in the chain," Cross said, her eyes gleaming with predatory journalistic instinct. "If he was paid to facilitate those deaths, or even just to look the other way and sign the certificates, his nerve will be brittle. A man who almost lost his license once will be terrified of a criminal investigation." "But we cannot approach him," Marsh countered, his voice tight with caution. "If we ask Whitby a single question, he will immediately telephone whoever is paying him. He will call Farwell, or he will call Norcott. The moment they know someone is looking at the physician, they will destroy whatever records remain and likely accelerate their timeline regarding Mrs. Finch." Cross tapped her pencil against the formica. "You're right. We can't spook the doctor until we have the trap fully set. What about your actuary? What did Hedges give you?" Marsh shook his head. "Nothing of value. Complaints about expense accounts and file hoarding. Hedges is a bitter man, but he is entirely blind to the actual mechanics of what Farwell is doing." The reality of their precarious situation crystallized on the 4th day. Marsh was at his desk, meticulously reviewing a routine mortality table to maintain the appearance of normal work, when Thomas Hedges sought him out again. Hedges did not wait for lunch. He walked directly to Marsh's desk, leaned down as if inspecting a column of figures, and spoke in a lowered, urgent voice. "Elliot, I thought you should know. I heard from a secretary on the 4th floor." Hedges glanced nervously toward the glass-walled supervisor's office. "The managing director's office requested your personnel file 2 days ago." Marsh's hand paused over his slide rule. He did not look up. "My personnel file?" "Yes, and the IT access logs for the central records room," Hedges whispered. "I think they know about the unauthorized file access, Elliot. Whatever you were looking for, they are building a case." Hedges straightened up, patted Marsh on the shoulder with false hearty collegiality, and walked quickly away. Marsh stared at the mortality table, the numbers blurring slightly. Gerald Norcott was moving. The meeting 3 weeks ago had been a warning. The search of his desk had been a confirmation. Now the administrative guillotine was being raised. Marsh calculated the bureaucratic friction of the HR department. He had perhaps 2 or 3 more days before they formally moved against him, terminating his employment and confiscating his building pass. Once he was locked out of the building, his ability to gather evidence would drop to 0. That evening, the telephone rang in the hallway of Marsh's apartment. He answered it to hear the heavy clatter of coins dropping into a payphone mechanism, followed by the voice of Vivian Cross. She was calling from the courier's payphone in the lobby of the newspaper building. "I've been reviewing my notes on Hedges," Cross said, skipping any preamble. "The investigation into him as a source is a dead end. His complaints are entirely rooted in professional jealousy. They have no bearing on the cancellation pattern." "I know," Marsh said, his voice heavy. "I came to the same conclusion." "We have lost 3 days, Cross said, her frustration bleeding through the telephone wire. "We gained Roberta Finch, and we gained Whitby's name, but we cannot use either of them yet. Finch doesn't prove the fraud, and Whitby will run to his handlers." "Norcott has requested my personnel file," Marsh said quietly. "I have perhaps 48 hours before I am terminated." There was a long silence on the line. The static of the connection hissed in Marsh's ear. "Then the numbers are no longer enough, Elliot," Cross said, her voice hardening into a blade. "The demographic pattern is brilliant, but it is not a proof. If we are going to force the state to act before they fire you and before they kill Roberta Finch, We need the mechanism.
What do you suggest? Marsh asked.
We need to find the money, Cross said. The morning of the 5th day began with the heavy, rhythmic clatter of the Hartford Evening Courier newsroom, a sound Vivian Cross usually found clarifying. Today, it only underscored the precariousness of her position. She walked past the rows of gray metal desks, her hands buried in the pockets of her wool coat, her fingers resting against the wire binding of her stenographer's notebook. She did not stop at her own desk, but continued straight to the glass-walled office of her editor, Raymond Pruitt. Pruitt was a man who understood the architecture of power in Hartford. He lunched at the same private clubs as the vice presidents of Aetna, Travelers, and he knew exactly how much of the newspaper's operating budget relied on the full-page advertisements purchased by the city's insurance syndicates. Cross closed the door behind her, cutting off the noise of the typewriters. Pruitt looked up from his morning proofs, his expression settling into a mask of practiced patience. Cross did not sit down. She did not tell him about the man she had seen idling in a dark sedan across from her apartment the previous night. Nor did she mention the actuary, whose career was currently hanging by a thread. Instead, she asked a single, precise question. She asked directly whether Consolidated Fidelity Life's advertising contract with the Courier had any bearing on the paper's editorial decisions regarding investigative features. Pruitt removed his reading glasses and set them carefully on his blotter. He looked at her for a long moment, evaluating the angle of her inquiry. When he spoke, his voice was smooth and entirely devoid of sharp edges. He told her that the business side of the newspaper and the newsroom side operated as separate entities, separated by a wall of journalistic integrity. It was a perfectly constructed sentence that functioned as neither a yes nor a no. Cross nodded once, her face betraying nothing. She understood the translation perfectly. Pruitt would not protect her, and he would not run the story on suspicion alone. She could not tell him how far along the investigation was, nor could she reveal Elliot Marsh's name until she possessed something so structurally sound that Pruitt could not legally or professionally suppress it. Without undeniable proof, the company's lawyers would crush the Courier, and Pruitt would hand her over to them to save the paper. She thanked him for his time and walked back out into the newsroom. 4 blocks away, on Pearl Street, Elliot Marsh arrived at his 4th-floor office in the Consolidated Fidelity Life building. He hung his brown wool coat on the rack, checked the diagonal alignment of his slide rule in his breast pocket, and sat at his desk. Resting precisely in the center of his green desk blotter was a formal memorandum printed on heavy, watermarked company stationery. It had been issued by the Human Resources Department. Marsh read the text twice, his eyes scanning the typewritten letters with the same detached focus he applied to mortality tables. He was instructed to present himself to the department head at 2 o'clock that afternoon, regarding the unauthorized access of restricted personnel files. It was not an immediate termination. Marsh calculated the bureaucratic friction of the institution. A company as large and methodical as Consolidated Fidelity did not simply fire an actuary of his tenure without establishing a paper trail of progressive discipline, especially when they wanted to avoid drawing attention to the files he had been viewing. The 2 o'clock meeting would result in a formal warning, accompanied by a 30-day probationary notation in his permanent record. He was still in the building, he still had his pass, but the administrative clock had officially started ticking. Desmond Farwell and Gerald Norcott were moving through the proper channels to excise him. Marsh folded the memo, placed it in his pocket, and went to work on his routine calculations, his face a mask of placid concentration. While Marsh waited for his 2 o'clock execution of discipline, Vivian Cross took a streetcar to the South End. She returned to the working-class neighborhood where the first of the 4 dead women had lived. The houses here were narrow, built close together with small front porches and peeling paint, a stark contrast to the stone towers of the insurance district. Cross spent the morning and early afternoon moving methodically from door to door, utilizing her established cover story. She introduced herself as a feature writer researching a piece on widows' financial planning in the post-war economy. It was tedious, repetitive work, requiring her to ask the same questions in 3 different ways to penetrate the natural suspicion of the residents. On the 3rd door she knocked on, 2 streets over from the deceased woman's former address, the door was opened by a woman in her late 40s with tired eyes and flour on her apron. She introduced herself as Margaret Dole, the niece of the woman who had died 11 months prior. Cross stepped into the narrow hallway, offering her practiced, sympathetic pitch. Margaret Dole did not need to be coaxed. The mention of her aunt's finances brought a sudden, hard bitterness to her face. Unprompted, Dole told Cross that the insurance company was a den of thieves. She explained that she had written a formal letter to Consolidated Fidelity Life immediately after her aunt's cancellation, demanding an explanation, and had never received the courtesy of a reply. Cross felt the familiar, cold electric charge of a breaking lead. She kept her voice entirely level. She asked Dole if she had kept a copy of the correspondence. Dole led Cross into the small kitchen at the back of the house. She opened a wooden drawer beside the sink. Cross stood close enough to observe the contents, a jumble of twine, old receipts, and a stack of folded papers. The smell of cedar drifted up from the drawer, which was lined with patterned shelf paper. Dole's hands sifted through the stack and extracted a document. It was a carbon copy of the letter, yellowed slightly at the fold lines. Dole handed it over. Cross held it carefully, noting the faint purple of the carbon ink against the thin, translucent second sheet. The letter was dated 9 months before the story began. It clearly named the aunt's policy number, but it was the second paragraph that made Cross's breath catch in her throat. Dole had written to ask why the cancellation notice had arrived exactly 2 weeks before her aunt's sudden, fatal illness, and had pointedly asked whether the timing was coincidental. The letter was addressed to the customer service department. Cross knew immediately why it had never been answered. Desmond Farwell, who remembered every policy number he had ever worked, monitored the incoming mail for the policies he had flagged. He had intercepted it. Cross asked Dole for permission to transcribe the document. Standing at the kitchen counter, she opened her stenographer's notebook and wrote down every word, capturing the exact dates, the policy number, and the phrasing of Dole's suspicion. She thanked the woman, offered a platitude about the slow nature of corporate mail, and left the house. She walked 4 blocks until she found a pharmacy with a public payphone. She dropped her coins into the slot and dialed the direct line to Marsh's desk. When he answered, his voice was low and controlled. "I have something," Cross said, the heavy receiver pressed tight against her ear. She read Margaret Dole's letter to him, word for word, her voice steady over the static of the line. When she finished, there was a long silence on the other end. Cross could hear the faint, ambient noise of the actuarial floor behind Marsh, the distant ringing of other telephones. "The 2-week gap," Marsh said finally, his voice dropping an octave, "between the date of the cancellation notice and the onset of the fatal illness. It is consistent across all 4 deaths in my comparison table." Neither of them said what this meant out loud. They did not use the word murder. The telephone lines of Hartford were routed through switchboards operated by people who talked, and the sheer mechanical reality of what they were discussing was too massive to speak into a wire. The cancellation was not merely a financial maneuver, it was the starting gun. "I need to verify the medical side," Cross said. "I will call you tonight." She hung up and immediately dialed another number. Cross possessed a network of sources built over years of covering the city's underbelly, including a contact at the county medical examiner's office she usually shared with the newspaper's court reporter. She reached the clerk on the 2nd ring. Using a pretext of verifying a routine publicly registered obituary detail for a retrospective piece, Cross asked for the publicly registered house call billing records for Dr. Clarence Whitby. The clerk balked initially, citing patient privacy, but Cross pressed, reminding him that she was not asking for medical files or diagnoses, only the publicly registered billing dates for house calls, which were filed with the county for tax and licensing purposes. She asked for the specific 14-month period that covered all 12 of the cancellations Marsh had identified. The clerk, owing her a favor from a previous year, agreed to pull the ledger and read the dates to her. Cross stood in the pharmacy for 40 minutes, her pencil flying across the pages of her notebook, recording every date Dr. Whitby had billed for a house call during those 14 months. That evening, the 6th day of the investigation, Cross met Marsh at the Blue Anchor Diner on Farmington Avenue. The diner was mostly empty, the dinner rush having long since cleared out. The only sounds were the cook scraping the grill in the back with a heavy metal spatula and the low hum of the neon sign in the window. 2 cups of coffee were going cold on the formica table between them. Marsh had survived his 2 o'clock meeting. He bore the 30-day probationary notation, but he was still employed. He spread his comparison table out on the table. Cross laid her shorthand notes beside it. I cross-referenced Whitby's billed house calls against the dates of death for the 4 women, Cross said, tapping her pencil against the notebook. The billing records show absolutely no visits to any of the 4 dead women in the 2 weeks before their deaths. Marsh stared at the numbers. He adjusted his glasses, his eyes tracing the columns of his own spreadsheet, then looking at the dates Cross had transcribed. He understood the mechanics of data. He knew that an anomaly could be a clerical error, but a consistent void was a design. If he was the attending physician, Marsh said, his voice barely above a whisper, and they suffered sudden, fatal illnesses, he would have been called to their homes. He was, Cross said. But any visits Whitby made in those 2-week windows were unregistered, unbilled, and deliberately unrecorded. He kept them off the county ledger. This absence was itself evidence. It was the negative space that defined the shape of the conspiracy. Marsh stared at the gap in the data for a long time. He took a mechanical pencil from his breast pocket, unscrewed the lead, and wrote the word deliberate in the margin of his comparison table, right next to Whitby's name. The word looked stark and terrifying against the neat rows of actuarial mathematics. On the 7th day, Cross made a tactical decision she deliberately withheld from Marsh. She knew the actuary, bound by his reliance on documentary evidence and systemic rules, would counsel against it. He would call it an unnecessary physical risk. But Cross knew that paper trails eventually required human leverage to break open. At 5 o'clock, she parked her car 2 blocks from the Consolidated Fidelity building and waited. When Desmond Farwell emerged through the heavy brass doors, Cross stepped out of her vehicle and followed him on foot. Farwell was a precise dresser, wearing a charcoal suit that fit perfectly, never a hair out of place. He walked with the measured, unhurried gait of a man who believed the world was ordered exactly to his specifications. He did not look over his shoulder. He walked 3 blocks north, turning onto Church Street, and approached a multi-level concrete parking garage. Cross hung back, letting him enter the structure before she slipped inside. The transition from the open street to the garage was immediate and oppressive. The air was thick with the smell of exhaust and damp concrete. The lighting was poor, casting long, distorted shadows across the parked sedans. Farwell bypassed the elevators and opened the heavy fire door leading to the stairwell. Cross waited 10 seconds, then caught the door before it latched, slipping into the stairwell behind him. She moved with extreme care, placing her feet on the very edges of the concrete steps, where they were less likely to echo. She climbed 1 level up, positioning herself on the landing above the 2nd floor. She could hear the way sound traveled in the closed stairwell. The acoustic properties of the concrete shaft meant that whispered words arrived slightly ahead of their own echo. Below her, on the 2nd floor landing, Farwell stopped. Another man was already waiting there. Cross leaned infinitesimally over the railing, catching a glimpse of broad shoulders and a tailored overcoat. It was Gerald Norcott. "You are late," Norcott said. His voice was unhurried, carrying the heavy, authoritative cadence of a man who let silences do his threatening for him. "I was ensuring my desk was entirely clear," Farwell replied, his tone defensive but maintaining its usual crisp articulation. "The situation is deteriorating," Norcott said. "The journalist and the actuary are further along than anticipated. Marsh has not stopped looking, despite the HR warning. The Finch cancellation must be suspended immediately. Cross held her breath to reduce the ambient noise in her own ears. She pressed her back against the cold concrete wall, opening her notebook.
Suspended?
Farwell's voice rose slightly, losing a fraction of its polish. The paperwork is already in motion. If we pull it back now, it creates an irregularity in the workflow. It draws more attention. You will suspend it, Norcott said, the silence following his words pressing down like a physical weight. We are pausing all activity. If they find the connection to Whitby, the variance is no longer defensible. You cannot simply halt the machinery because you are nervous, Gerald, Farwell said. The use of the managing director's first name was a sharp breach of protocol, signaling a shift in their dynamic. I have taken the primary risk here. I'm the one accessing the files, flagging the targets, and coordinating with the doctor. If this collapses, I am the exposed nerve. Which is why you will do exactly as I say, Norcott replied. No, Farwell said, his voice dropping into a register of cold survival. I will not be left holding the bag for this. You authorized every target, and I have the ledger to prove it. Every transaction between us is recorded, dates, amounts, initials. If I fall, that ledger goes to the state commission. Cross's pencil flew across the paper. The particular scratch of the graphite moving fast on the notebook paper seemed deafening to her, but the men below were entirely focused on each other. She wrote in rapid shorthand, capturing the exact phrasing. Ledger. Every transaction between us. Norcott did not respond immediately. The silence stretched out, thick and venomous, lasting for a full 5 seconds. Cross could hear the distant scrape of a car tire on the level below them, a harsh, rubbery squeal that echoed up the shaft. Keep it secure, Desmond, Norcott said finally, his voice devoid of its previous warmth, replaced by something entirely hollow. Do not make me regret our partnership. Footsteps echoed as Norcott opened the heavy fire door and exited the stairwell. A moment later, Farwell did the same, walking in the opposite direction. Cross did not move. She remained frozen against the wall, breathing shallowly in the dim light cast by a single cage bulb 2 flights up. She waited until their voices and footsteps had been gone for 3 full minutes. She understood exactly what she had witnessed. She had seen Farwell use the existence of a private ledger as leverage against the managing director of Consolidated Fidelity Life, and neither man knew she was above them. That evening, Cross met Marsh again at the diner. The late-night atmosphere was identical to the night before, the same cook scraping the same grill, the same 2 cups of coffee going cold on the table. But the energy between them had fundamentally shifted. Cross laid her notebook on the table and translated her shorthand, telling Marsh everything she had heard in the stairwell. She recited the dialogue verbatim. Marsh listened, his posture rigid. He did not reprimand her for taking the risk. His mind was already processing the variables. Where is the ledger? He asked. I don't know, Cross said. I only know that Farwell has it somewhere accessible enough to use as a threat, and that Norcott is terrified of it. Marsh looked down at his own hands. A ledger, he said softly. Dates, amounts, initials. It is the mechanism. The demographic pattern proves the anomaly. The Whitby billing gap proves the medical complicity. The Dole letter proves the suppression. But the ledger proves the financial motive. It proves the fraud. He looked up at Cross, his eyes sharp behind his glasses. If we can locate that ledger, and if we can get it to a law enforcement body that is not dependent on the company's charity, it is enough. It is the proof you need to publish, and it is the proof the state needs to arrest them. We have to find it before Norcott decides Farwell is a liability and takes it himself, Cross said. Marsh nodded. He gathered his papers, his movements precise and deliberate. He left the diner and walked back to his apartment through the cold Hartford night. He sat at his small kitchen table, the overhead light casting a harsh glare over his work surface. He took out a fresh pad of lined paper and his fountain pen, Methodically, drawing on his years of compiling actuarial reports, he began to write up a clean, comprehensive summary of everything they had established over the past 7 days. He documented the demographic pattern, detailing the specific criteria Farwell had used to target the widows. He wrote out the probability figure, 1 in 2,000, explaining the mathematical impossibility of the sequence occurring by natural variance. He detailed the Whitby billing gap, citing the 14-month period and the specific 2-week voids preceding each death. He transcribed the contents of the Dole letter, noting the interception by customer service. Finally, he documented the overheard conversation regarding the ledger, citing Cross as the witness. He worked for 4 hours. When he was finished, he had a single document. He read through it, checking his arithmetic, verifying his dates, ensuring that every sentence was complete, qualified, and irrefutable. He then carefully copied the entire document 2 more times by hand, creating 3 identical master files. The document was now 9 pages long. Marsh stacked the pages together, tapping the edges against the table to align them perfectly. He stared at the neat, handwritten lines. It was no longer a theory. It was an indictment. Sitting alone in his quiet apartment, listening to the wind rattle the window panes, Elliot Marsh realized that the 9 pages resting under his hands were the most dangerous thing he had ever held. The morning after the break-in, the cold in Hartford possessed a sharp, metallic quality, the kind of November chill that seemed to radiate upward from the pavement. Elliot Marsh stood inside a glass-paneled payphone booth on the corner of Trumbull Street, his breath fogging the glass as he deposited a nickel into the slot. He listened to the mechanical swallow of the coin, the series of clicks, and the hollow ringing on the other end. He was wearing his brown wool suit, the same one he wore every Monday, though today was not Monday. His slide rule rested securely in his breast pocket, a familiar weight against his ribs. When Vivian Cross answered, her voice was crisp, devoid of morning lethargy. Marsh did not offer a greeting. He spoke in complete, qualified sentences, detailing his return to his apartment the previous night and the discovery of the empty envelope on his floor. He explained the precise dimensions of the envelope, the way the flap had been torn rather than sliced, and the inescapable conclusion that his residence was no longer secure. "Do you still have the original comparison table?" Cross asked. Her tone did not elevate. It remained steady, anchored in the practical requirements of their situation. "And the 9-page summary you wrote up?" "I have both on my person," Marsh replied. He pressed his hand against the inside of his coat, feeling the stiff resistance of the folded paper. "I did not leave them in the apartment." "Good," Cross said. "Do not return to your apartment alone after dark. When you are finished today, bring both documents directly to my office. The newspaper building has a night security guard. It is not a fortress, but it is better than a residential lock." Marsh agreed and severed the connection. He stepped out of the booth into the biting wind. He did not turn toward Pearl Street and the towering stone edifice of the Consolidated Fidelity Life Building. Instead, he adjusted the collar of his coat and began the long walk toward Columbus Boulevard. The State Insurance Commission offices occupied the 2nd floor of a municipal building that had been designed with an eye toward imposing bureaucratic authority. Marsh walked through the heavy double doors and entered the waiting room. The space was defined by the institutional green of the waiting room walls, a shade that seemed designed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Behind the reception desk hung a framed portrait of the sitting governor, his expression one of practiced, civic benevolence, positioned directly beside a framed, meticulously typeset copy of the state insurance code. From behind a frosted glass partition at the rear of the room, the relentless, percussive sound of manual typewriters bled into the quiet space, a mechanical rhythm that reminded Marsh of the typing pools at Fidelity. He approached the desk and asked to speak with an examiner. After a 20-minute wait, he was received by a staff investigator named Harold Vane. Vane was a man whose posture suggested years spent leaning over columns of figures. His suit was gray, his tie unremarkable, his eyes sharp and assessing. He led Marsh into a small, windowless office that smelled faintly of binding glue and stale coffee. Marsh sat across from Vane and withdrew the comparison table and the probability calculation from his coat. He did not mention the green cloth-bound ledger. He did not mention Dr. Clarence Whitby. He presented only the mathematics. He laid the papers on the desk, aligning the edges perfectly with the blotter, and began to explain the demographic anomaly, the isolation of the cohort, and the 1 in 2,000 probability of the sequence occurring by natural variance. Vane listened in absolute silence. He did not interrupt. When Marsh finished, Vane picked up the probability calculation. He studied it for 3 full minutes. Then he looked up and asked 3 questions. He asked about the standard deviation applied to the baseline mortality rate for the specific age bracket. He asked how Marsh had isolated the geographic variables within the cohort. Finally, he asked whether the reinsurance reconciliation reports had been adjusted for seasonal mortality spikes. The questions were precise. They told Marsh instantly that Vane understood actuarial analysis at a fundamental level. Vane was not a clerk. He was a mathematician who had chosen civil service. "Your methodology is sound, Mr. Marsh," Vane said, his voice dropping to a low, careful register. "The math is entirely sound, but numbers alone do not constitute a legal accusation. Before the Commission can open a formal file, I will need a formal complaint in writing, submitted with all supporting documentation. We cannot act on an informal presentation." Marsh nodded slowly. "I understand the procedural requirements." Vane leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. He glanced toward the closed door of his office before speaking again. "Off the record, Mr. Marsh. The Commission received 2 anonymous complaints regarding Consolidated Fidelity Life's cancellation practices 8 months ago. They were routed through the standard channels. We reviewed them, but without internal data or a named complainant, they were closed for insufficient evidence." Marsh felt a sudden, cold stillness settle over him. 8 months ago. That aligned perfectly with the timeline of the intercepted letters. "Who filed them?" Marsh asked, his voice tight. "I cannot say," Vane replied, his expression unreadable. "The files are sealed. But you should know that you are not the first person to notice a shadow in this particular room." Marsh thanked Vane, gathered his preliminary papers, and left the building. Walking back out into the cold, he processed the implication of Vane's disclosure. The anonymous complaints were almost certainly the letters Desmond Farwell had intercepted, letters like the one Margaret Dole had written. Farwell had buried them internally, but somehow, 1 or 2 had slipped through the cracks and reached the Commission anyway. It was the first indication of a crack in the suppression. The company's control was not absolute. While Marsh was at the Commission, Vivian Cross was spending the entirety of Day 9 sitting in a booth at a diner on Asylum Avenue. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, but the waitress, recognizing the hard, focused set of Cross's jaw, had stopped asking if she wanted a warm-up. Cross's attention was fixed entirely on the view through the diner window. Across the street stood the practice of Dr. Clarence Whitby. It was a modest, 2-story brick building that projected an aura of old-fashioned neighborhood reliability. A painted wooden sign hung above the door, its lettering slightly faded by the weather. The white curtains in the first-floor window were drawn, never fully open, allowing only a sliver of the interior to be seen from the street. Cross watched the entrance with the patience of a predator. She knew Whitby's listed office hours began at 9 o'clock. Whitby did not arrive until 40 minutes past the hour. When he finally appeared, walking up the sidewalk from where he had parked his car, Cross noted his physical condition immediately. He moved with a slow, deliberate caution, as if the pavement beneath his feet were unstable. His overcoat hung slightly too large on his frame, the shoulders drooping, suggesting he had lost a significant amount of weight since he bought it. He stopped at the newsstand on the corner to purchase a morning paper. Through the diner window, Cross watched the transaction. When Whitby reached out to accept his change from the vendor, his hand shook violently. The tremor was not subtle. It was a pronounced, uncontrollable vibration that forced him to use his other hand to steady his grip. Cross opened her stenographer's notebook and recorded the observation. Her source at the county medical examiner's office had told her that Whitby's colleagues had noticed the same thing, a sudden, visible deterioration in the man's physical and nervous constitution. Watching him now, Cross understood that Whitby was buckling under the psychological weight of what he had done. He was the weakest corner of Gerald Norcott's strongbox. On the morning of day 10, Cross decided it was time to apply pressure to that corner. She left the diner and crossed Asylum Avenue just as Whitby was approaching the front steps of his practice. The morning air was sharp, carrying the scent of exhaust and damp leaves. Cross stepped into Whitby's path, blocking his access to the wrought iron railing that led up to his door. "Dr. Whitby?" she said. Her voice was flat, carrying no warmth, no introductory pleasantries. Whitby stopped. He looked at her, his eyes rheumy and shadowed with exhaustion. "Yes?" "The office isn't open yet, miss." "My name is Vivian Cross. I am a reporter for the Hartford Evening Courier," she said, holding her notebook in her left hand, her pen in her right. She did not pause to let him process her identity. She delivered her 3 questions in a rapid, unbroken sequence, giving him no space to construct a lie. "Were you the attending physician for the deaths of 4 recently canceled Consolidated Fidelity policyholders whose names I have here? Did you make any unregistered house calls to these women in the 2 weeks immediately preceding their deaths? And are you aware that your publicly registered appointment billing records contain a gap that corresponds exactly to those 2-week windows?" Whitby's face did not change. The grandfatherly mask remained frozen in place, the muscles in his jaw locked tight. But his body reacted. His left hand shot out and closed on the wrought iron railing of his front steps. His knuckles turned stark white against the black metal. He gripped the iron so hard his forearm trembled, the same violent tremor Cross had observed the day before, now amplified by terror. He stared at her for a long, agonizing second. "I have nothing to say to a reporter," he managed to say, his voice thin and reedy. He pushed past her, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, and hurried up the steps. He unlocked the front door, stepped inside, and shut it firmly behind him. The deadbolt engaged with a loud, definitive click. Cross stood on the sidewalk. She did not attempt to follow him. She opened her notebook, uncapped her pen, and wrote down his exact expression at the moment she had spoken the phrase, "unregistered house calls." She wrote 4 words: not denial, recognition. She closed the notebook and slipped it into her coat pocket. She knew exactly what would happen next. Whitby was a frightened man who had just been confronted with the mathematical proof of his own crimes. He would not sit in his office and wait. He would call someone within the hour. She was right. The machinery of the company reacted with brutal efficiency. At that exact moment, Elliot Marsh was standing in the corridor of the Insurance Commission offices, having returned to clarify a formatting requirement for his formal complaint. Harold Vane stepped out of his office and gestured to Marsh. "Mr. Marsh," Vane said, his tone carefully neutral. "There is a telephone call for you at the reception desk. They say it is urgent." Marsh walked to the desk and picked up the heavy black receiver. "Marsh speaking." "Elliot," a voice said. It was the head of the Human Resources Department at Consolidated Fidelity Life. The voice was devoid of the usual corporate cordiality. "You are not at your desk. You missed your probationary check-in this morning." "I had an urgent personal matter," Marsh said, his voice steady, though his heart began to beat a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. "Your employment with Consolidated Fidelity Life is terminated, effective immediately," the HR director said. The words were clipped, rehearsed. "You are to return to the building, clear your personal items from your desk, and surrender your building pass by the end of the day. Security has been notified." The line went dead. Marsh held the receiver for a moment, listening to the dial tone, before placing it back on the cradle. The clock had not just run out. The glass had been shattered. Marsh took a city bus back to Pearl Street. He entered the Consolidated Fidelity Life Building and took the elevator to the 4th floor. A uniformed security guard was already standing by his desk. The floor was quiet. His colleagues kept their heads down, their eyes fixed firmly on their own slide rules and mortality tables. In the insurance capital of the world, a sudden termination was a contagion. No one wanted to be seen breathing the same air as the infected. Marsh cleared his personal items in exactly 20 minutes. He worked methodically, placing his spare pens, his coffee cup, and his reference books into a brown paper bag. He kept his breast pocket buttoned. The comparison table and the 9-page summary remained folded safely inside his coat. He did not look at the security guard. He did not look at his supervisor, Peterson, who had conveniently found a reason to be in the file room. When he was finished, Marsh picked up the paper bag. The security guard escorted him down the main aisle toward the elevators. The sensory details of his exit etched themselves into Marsh's memory with absolute clarity. The sharp, rhythmic sound of his own footsteps echoing on the polished marble tile, the awkward, shifting weight of his personal items in the paper bag, and the distinct, chemical smell of industrial floor wax mingling with the stale cigarette smoke that drifted down the stairwell from the executive's floor above. As they neared the elevator bank, Desmond Farwell emerged from a cross corridor. Farwell was impeccably dressed, as always, his suit perfectly tailored, not a hair out of place. He carried a stack of fresh policy files under his arm. Farwell stopped. He looked at Marsh, then at the paper bag, then at the security guard. A slow, pleasant smile spread across Farwell's face. He nodded at Marsh, a polite, dismissive gesture, the exact way a man nods at someone he will never have to think about again. It was a look of absolute victory. Marsh stopped. He adjusted his grip on the paper bag. He looked directly into Farwell's eyes, his own expression completely blank. He nodded back. Then he kept walking, stepping into the elevator and leaving the 4th floor behind. Vivian Cross was waiting for him outside the Fidelity building. She stood near the corner, her coat collar turned up against the wind off the Connecticut River. When she saw Marsh emerge with the paper bag, she did not offer sympathy. She fell into step beside him as he walked away from the imposing stone towers. "They terminated me," Marsh said quietly. "Whitby must have called Norcott." "He did," Cross said, "which means they know we are closing the circle. Norcott will try to sever the liabilities. We need the ledger." They stopped at a small park a few blocks away, sitting on a cold stone bench. Cross laid out her plan. It was based entirely on the conversation she had overheard in the parking garage stairwell. "Farwell uses that ledger as leverage," Cross explained, her breath visible in the air. "He told Norcott he had a record of every transaction between them. If he keeps it at the office, Norcott could have security seize it during a fabricated audit. If he keeps it in a safety deposit box, he can't produce it quickly enough to use as a threat. It has to be accessible, but secure from Norcott's immediate reach." Marsh processed the logic. "You believe it is at his home?" "It is the only place that fits the parameters," Cross said. "Do you know where he lives?" Marsh set his paper bag on the bench. He reached into his pocket, withdrew his fountain pen and a small slip of paper. Drawing on the unauthorized personnel files he had accessed weeks ago, he wrote down a street name and a house number. Prospect Avenue. He handed the slip to Cross. "We cannot break into his house," Marsh stated, a factual assertion rather than a moral objection. "If we obtain the ledger illegally, it becomes inadmissible. The state will throw it out, and Norcott's lawyers will bury us." "We are going to break in," Cross said, taking the slip of paper. "We are going to make the state do it for us." Cross left Marsh and walked to a payphone on Main Street. She called the Hartford Police Department's Detective Bureau and asked for Detective Sergeant Owen Greer. Greer was a veteran investigator who had covered the paper's courts beat for 6 years before earning his shield. He understood the mechanics of the city, and, more importantly, he owed Cross a professional favor from a corruption story she had spiked 2 years prior at his request. When Greer came on the line, Cross did not waste time. Owen, I have reason to believe there is documentary evidence of severe financial fraud, and potentially worse, located in a private residence on Prospect Avenue. Greer's voice was gravelly, cautious. Vivian, you know I can't kick in a door in the West End based on a reporter's hunch. It isn't a hunch, Cross said. A formal complaint is being filed with the State Insurance Commission tomorrow morning. It contains actuarial proof and medical billing discrepancies. When the commission opens their file, they will contact the Attorney General. The police will have grounds for a warrant. And what exactly are you asking me to do? I am asking you to be ready, Cross said. When the call comes down from the AG's office, I want you to be the one who takes the paper to a judge. If this gets routed through the normal channels, someone on the company payroll will stall it. It has to move fast. Greer was silent for a long moment. I'll keep my desk clear, he said finally, and hung up. The pressure continued to mount the following day, day 11. The company, realizing that Marsh's termination had not stopped the bleeding, began to accelerate their timeline. At 10 o'clock in the morning, the telephone rang at the Evening Courier newsroom. The receptionist routed the call to Cross's desk. It was Roberta Finch. Finch's voice, usually characterized by the sharp, indignant tone of a woman who balanced her household accounts to the penny, was entirely different. It was thin, trembling, stripped of its armor. Miss Cross, Finch said, her breathing shallow. I received another notice in the mail this morning. A cancellation? Cross asked, gripping her pen. No, Finch said. It says it is a policy review suspension. The language is very formal. It says my coverage is suspended pending a final medical and financial audit. Cross closed her eyes. It was the same thing. A cancellation wrapped in bureaucratic camouflage, designed to isolate the target before the final act. Miss Cross, Finch continued, the fear now naked in her voice. You asked me a lot of questions about my health when you were here. You asked about my doctor. Should I be worried about more than losing my policy? Cross did not hesitate. The time for journalistic distance had passed. Yes, Mrs. Finch, you should be. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Listen to me carefully, Cross said, her voice projecting absolute authority. Do you have a bag packed? No. Pack one now, just enough for a week. Do not tell anyone where you are going. I want you to go to your sister's house in Wethersfield immediately. Take a taxi. Do not take the bus. Stay inside her house. Do you understand? Yes, Finch whispered. Give me your sister's telephone number, Cross demanded. She wrote the number down in her notebook as Finch recited it. If anyone comes to the door, anyone you do not know, anyone claiming to be from the insurance company or any doctor you did not call, do not open it. Call the police and then call me. I will check on you tomorrow. Cross hung up the phone, her heart hammering against her ribs. The theoretical mathematics had just become a matter of immediate life and death. Farwell was moving to clear the board. On the morning of day 12, Elliot Marsh walked back into the State Insurance Commission offices on Columbus Boulevard. He carried a thick manila envelope. He did not wait for reception. He walked directly to Harold Vane's office and knocked in the door. Vane looked up from his desk. Marsh stepped inside and placed the envelope on the blotter. This is the formal written complaint, Marsh said. His voice was perfectly level, betraying none of the exhaustion that had settled into his bones over the past 48 hours. Vane opened the envelope. He pulled out the documents. Marsh had assembled them with the precision of a master architect. Exhibit A, the comparison table detailing the 12 canceled policies and the 4 subsequent deaths. Exhibit B, the probability calculation demonstrating the mathematical impossibility of the sequence. Exhibit C, the Whitby billing gap data, cross-referenced with the dates of death. Exhibit D, the carbon copy of Margaret Dole's intercepted letter proving the company's prior knowledge and suppression. Vane read through the summary page, He looked at the dole letter, tracing the date with his index finger. He looked up at Marsh, the bureaucratic caution entirely gone from his eyes, replaced by a grim, professional realization. "Wait by a telephone," Vane said. Marsh left the building and walked to the Evening Courier offices. He sat in a chair near Cross's desk, watching the chaotic churn of the newsroom, feeling entirely disconnected from it. He was a man of numbers, sitting in a room of words. 3 hours later, the telephone on Cross's desk rang. Cross answered, listened for a moment, and handed the receiver to Marsh. "Mr. Marsh," Vane's voice came through the earpiece, tight and urgent. "The Commission is opening an emergency file. I have just concluded a meeting with the State Attorney General's office. They have reviewed your exhibits. A warrant application for Desmond Farwell's home and the Actuarial Records Division of Consolidated Fidelity Life is being prepared as we speak." Marsh closed his eyes. The math had spoken. The state had listened. "Thank you, Mr. Vane," Marsh said, and handed the phone back to Cross. He relayed the message. Cross nodded, her expression hardening. "The warrants will take time to sign," Cross said. "Norcott's lawyers might still find a way to stall the judge. We need the final nail. We need Whitby." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the temperature plummeted, Cross sat in her car parked half a block down from Dr. Clarence Whitby's practice on Asylum Avenue. The engine was off. The cold seeped through the floorboards, chilling her feet, but she did not move. She watched the painted wooden sign. She watched the white curtains. At 6:30, the front door opened. Whitby walked out. He did not look like a respected community physician. He looked like a ghost haunting his own life. He locked the door, walked down the steps, and got into his car. Cross waited until his taillights illuminated, then started her engine. She followed him, keeping a safe distance. Whitby did not drive home. He drove exactly 4 blocks down Asylum Avenue, turning onto a quiet, tree-lined side street. He pulled over to the curb and parked. Cross parked 50 yards behind him, cutting her headlights. She watched. For 3 full minutes, Whitby did not move. He sat behind the steering wheel of his parked car, staring straight ahead into the darkness. Cross could imagine the psychological weight crushing him in that small, enclosed space. The realization that the walls were closing in, that the reporter knew about the billing gaps, that the company would inevitably cut him loose to save themselves. Finally, the driver's side door opened. Whitby stepped out onto the pavement. He pulled his oversized overcoat tight around his frail frame and began to walk toward the corner. On the corner stood a solitary glass payphone booth. Cross got out of her car. She moved silently, keeping to the shadows of the large oak trees that lined the sidewalk. Whitby stepped into the phone booth. The harsh yellow light from the overhead bulb flickered on, falling directly onto his face. It illuminated the deep, cavernous lines of exhaustion around his mouth and the dark, bruised skin beneath his eyes. He reached into his pocket for a coin. His hand was shaking so badly he dropped it. He bent down, retrieved it, and stood back up. He reached for the heavy black receiver, but his hand hovered over it, not yet making contact. His breath plumed in the cold November air, visible and ragged in the yellow light. Before he could lift the receiver from the hook, Cross stepped out of the shadows and into the light of the street lamp. Whitby froze. He looked at her through the glass of the booth. His hand slowly lowered from the receiver. He pushed the folding glass door open and stepped out into the biting wind, standing face to face with the reporter who had dismantled his life in 3 questions. The fight was entirely gone from him. His shoulders slumped, the oversized coat making him look small, pathetic, and utterly defeated. He looked at Cross, his eyes watering in the cold, and spoke in a voice that was barely more than a whisper. It was a sentence Cross would memorize instantly, a sentence she would quote in full in the lead paragraph of her article. "I want to speak to someone from the state," Whitby said, his voice cracking on the final word, "before I speak to anyone else." The biting wind off the Connecticut River swept down Asylum Avenue, rattling the folding glass door of the payphone booth. Inside the narrow enclosure, Dr. Clarence Whitby stood frozen, his hand hovering inches from the heavy black receiver. The harsh, yellow light from the overhead bulb illuminated the deep, cavernous lines of exhaustion around his mouth and the dark, bruised skin beneath his eyes. He looked at Vivian Cross, his shoulders slumped beneath an oversized overcoat that made him look small, pathetic, and utterly defeated. "I want to speak to someone from the state," Whitby said, his voice cracking on the final word, "before I speak to anyone else." Before Cross could reply, the heavy rhythm of footsteps sounded on the concrete behind her. She did not need to turn to know who it was. She had recognized the idling engine of the dark Plymouth sedan that had pulled to the curb half a block away 10 minutes earlier. Raymond Pruitt, the managing editor of the Hartford Evening Courier, stepped into the pool of yellow light spilling from the street lamp. He wore his heavy wool overcoat unbuttoned, his face set in a mask of institutional caution. He had been tracking her movements all evening, acutely aware that his reporter was pulling at a thread that could unravel the paper's most lucrative advertising contracts. Pruitt looked at Whitby, then at Cross. He opened his mouth to issue an editorial directive to remind her of the boundaries of her employment, but Cross did not give him the opportunity. Cross looked directly at Pruitt, standing on the sidewalk in front of Whitby, and delivered the death blow to his leverage. She told him, her voice flat and devoid of triumph, that she was not filing the story to the Courier. She was filing it to the Associated Press Bureau in Hartford, whose offices were located on Prospect Street. She reminded him, with surgical precision, that the Courier's advertising contract with Consolidated Fidelity Life had absolutely no effect on a national wire service. Pruitt stared at her. The wind caught the brim of his hat, but he did not move to adjust it. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the realization that the machinery of suppression had just broken down. Behind Cross, the glass door of the phone booth creaked open a few more inches. Whitby shivered violently, his teeth chattering in the freezing November air. He looked at the two journalists, his eyes watering, and said, in a voice stripped of all professional dignity, that he wanted to go inside somewhere warm. Cross brought Whitby to the Hartford Evening Courier's building on Trumbull Street. The newsroom was largely empty at this hour, a cavern of silent typewriters and shadowed desks. She bypassed the main editorial floor and led the physician directly into the rear conference room. It was a windowless space where she possessed no editorial authority whatsoever, but it contained the one piece of equipment she required, a heavy rotary telephone. She left Whitby sitting at the long oak table, his hands wrapped around a cup of black coffee he was shaking too badly to drink, and dialed the Hartford Police Department's Detective Bureau. She asked for Detective Sergeant Owen Greer. When Greer answered, his voice thick with the late-hour fatigue of the court's beat, Cross told him she had a voluntary witness sitting in front of her. She stated that this witness had attended 3 of the 4 deceased policyholders before their deaths, and that he wished to make a formal statement to state authorities before speaking to anyone else. Greer did not ask for the witness's name. He told her to keep the door locked. He arrived at the Courier building within 30 minutes, bringing with him an assistant attorney general named Patricia Burrell, a woman whose severe, unpowdered face and sharp eyes suggested a deep familiarity with the mechanics of corporate fraud. The taking of Whitby's statement lasted for 2 agonizing hours. The atmosphere in the conference room was suffocating, defined by the smell of stale cigarette smoke trapped in the heavy fabric of the upholstery and the relentless, rhythmic scratch of the Assistant Attorney General's shorthand pen on legal paper. It was the particular silence of a man speaking slowly because he has decided to tell the truth and is choosing each word with the knowledge that it will end his life as he knows it. Whitby sat hunched over the table, his hands trembling continuously. He did not ask for a lawyer. He described the arrangement with a clinical detachment that only highlighted the horror of the mechanics. He stated that Gerald Norcott had contacted him through Desmond Farwell approximately 20 months prior to this night. The managing director had offered a lucrative per-consultation fee for house calls to specific patients whose identities Farwell would provide on a rolling basis. Burrell's pen scratched across the paper. She asked, in a voice devoid of judgment, what these consultations entailed. Whitby closed his eyes. He stated that the visits involved the administration of a specific substance. He named the compound, a potent cardiac glycoside that would mimic the exact physiological markers of sudden heart failure in elderly patients. Burrell recorded the chemical name in her precise shorthand without pausing. Whitby confessed that while the first 2 visits had been presented to him under the guise of experimental therapeutic trials, he understood the true purpose of the administrations from the 3rd visit onward. He understood that he was being paid to ensure that recently canceled policyholders died before they could appeal their status or seek legal counsel. And he continued to make the visits. He wept silently as he finished the statement, the tears tracking through the deep lines of his face. Burrell reviewed her notes, asked 3 clarifying questions regarding the method of payment, and closed her legal pad. On the strength of Whitby's detailed confession, Burrell moved with terrifying speed. By dawn, she had drafted the necessary affidavits. By 8 o'clock the following morning, a state judge had signed the orders. Burrell obtained a search warrant for Desmond Farwell's private residence on Prospect Avenue and a simultaneous warrant for the Actuarial Records Division of Consolidated Fidelity Life. The execution of the warrants took place on the morning of day 14. The sky over Hartford was the color of bruised iron, threatening snow. At Farwell's immaculate home on Prospect Avenue, state police and commission investigators approached the front door. Farwell answered in a pressed suit, his hair perfectly combed. He did not feign ignorance. When presented with the warrant, his precise nature seemed to take over. He surrendered the small brass key to his home desk without resistance, leading the investigators into his study. The search was brief. The sound of the locked drawer being opened with Farwell's surrendered key echoed loudly in the quiet, dustless room. Inside, resting atop a stack of neatly filed utility bills, was a green, cloth-bound ledger. It was small enough to fit in an overcoat pocket, its corners slightly frayed from use. When the lead investigator opened it, the mathematics of murder were laid bare. The ledger recorded 23 distinct transactions between Farwell and Norcott, spanning exactly 20 months. It detailed dates, precise monetary amounts, and the initials of each deceased policyholder. Outside, an Associated Press photographer, tipped off by Cross, stood waiting on the front walk in the biting cold, capturing the moment the investigators emerged with the ledger in an evidence bag. Cross telephoned Elliot Marsh from a payphone near the AP bureau to tell him what they had found. Marsh stood in his apartment, looking down at his own 9-page summary and his slide rule. He listened to Cross describe the columns, the dates, the initials, and the corresponding amounts. "It is," Marsh said, his voice steady but carrying the profound weight of a man who has just seen the architecture of a nightmare confirmed, "the most precise piece of evidence I have ever heard described." Simultaneously, a second team of commission investigators, accompanied by uniformed Hartford police, entered the Consolidated Fidelity Life building on Pearl Street. They bypassed the marble lobby and took the elevators directly to the 4th floor. They moved with a coordinated efficiency that shattered the quiet, ecclesiastical authority of the underwriting department. The investigators seized the actuarial files for all 12 canceled policies. They confiscated the specific reinsurance reconciliation reports that Marsh had first noticed the anomaly in 6 weeks prior. They unplugged and seized Farwell's heavy, steel-cased personnel computer, along with every physical file in his desk. Gerald Norcott emerged from his corner office, his broad shoulders squared, his face an unreadable mask of corporate indignation. He demanded to know the meaning of the intrusion and immediately attempted to telephone the company's external counsel. Patricia Burrell, standing amidst the flurry of confiscation, placed her hand firmly on the receiver of Norcott's telephone, pressing the cradle down. She looked up at the managing director. She told him, in a voice that carried across the suddenly silent floor, that he was not currently under arrest, but that he should not attempt to leave the building. Norcott stared at her, the silence doing his threatening for him, but Burrell did not blink. For the first time in his career, Norcott's silence was entirely impotent. The illusion of normal variance collapsed entirely at 11 o'clock that morning. Desmond Farwell was formally arrested in the study of his home. Gerald Norcott was arrested in his corner office at the company headquarters, his hands cuffed in front of the framed letter from the governor that hung on his wall. Both men were transported to the police bureau and charged with fraud, conspiracy, and 4 counts of homicide. The charges were read publicly at the courthouse on Washington Street early that afternoon. The sensory reality of the justice system stood in stark contrast to the plush carpets of the insurance company. The cold marble floor of the courthouse reflected the harsh, buzzing overhead fluorescent lights. The clerk read the charge sheet aloud in a flat, echoing voice, stripping the crimes of their actuarial camouflage and reducing them to the brutal, premeditated taking of human life. The only other sound in the gallery was the frantic, scratching rhythm of the reporters' pencils moving across their notepads. Elliot Marsh was not present at the courthouse. He remained in his apartment, sitting at his kitchen table, wearing his brown wool suit. He learned of the formal charges from Cross's brief, factual telephone call. He hung up the receiver, aligned his slide rule perfectly parallel to the edge of the table, and exhaled a breath he felt he had been holding for 6 weeks. Back at the Courier Building, Cross sat in the conference room, her typewriter keys hammering out the final draft of her story. Raymond Pruitt stood in the doorway, holding a written objection citing breach of contract, insubordination, and the catastrophic financial ruin of the newspaper. He placed the formal warning on the table beside her typewriter. Cross did not stop typing. She did not even look up. When she finished, she pulled the pages from the roller, folded them into her coat pocket, and walked out of the Courier Building. She walked the 3 blocks to Prospect Street and entered the Associated Press Bureau. The AP Bureau was a symphony of mechanical urgency. Cross handed her copy to the bureau chief, a man who cared nothing for the social ecosystem of Hartford's insurance executives. He stood behind her, reading over her shoulder without speaking a single word until his eyes reached the final paragraph. He nodded once. Cross sat at the teletype machine to file her piece. The mechanical clatter of the wire machine transmitting each character was deafening, a percussive rhythm of truth being punched into the national consciousness. The room smelled heavily of hot metal and fresh ink, the industrial perfume of irreversible consequence. The AP ran the story on the wire at exactly 2:30 in the afternoon. The impact was instantaneous and devastating. Within 90 minutes, every afternoon paper in Connecticut had pulled their front pages to run the wire copy. The demographic pattern, the probability figures, the complicit physician, the green ledger, and the arrests of the managing director and the senior underwriting examiner were broadcast to the entire eastern seaboard. The Hartford Morning Current, the city's paper of record, which shared a building with 2 consolidated Fidelity board members, attempted a final, pathetic act of institutional loyalty. They ran a heavily edited version of the story the following morning that deliberately omitted Gerald Norcott's name from the headline, burying his involvement in the 7th paragraph. They were brutally reamed by the AP correspondent in print the very same day, accused of journalistic cowardice and complicity in a follow-up wire that humiliated the Current's editorial board on a national scale. In a small house on Wethersfield Avenue, Roberta Finch sat at her kitchen table, a cup of tea growing cold beside her. She had spent the last week staying with her sister in Wethersfield, terrified of every knock at the door. Now she read the afternoon paper, her sharp 71-year-old eyes scanning Cross's meticulous prose. She read about the ledger. She read about the cardiac substance. She read about the 4 women who had received the same notices she had. Finch picked up the telephone and called the Evening Courier. She asked for Vivian Cross, and when told Cross was no longer in the building, she demanded to be transferred to whoever was handling the follow-up. She gave a full, unsparing interview. Her statement was clear and devastating. She detailed how she had received a policy review notice, how she had written a letter that was never answered, and how she had been told by a reporter to leave her home for her own safety because her insurance company was trying to kill her. Roberta Finch's words became the human center of Cross's follow-up piece for the AP. Her sentence regarding the unanswered letter became the most reprinted quote across Connecticut, transforming a story about statistical anomalies into a terrifying reality for every widow holding a life insurance policy.
2 days after the arrests, Elliot Marsh received a telephone call from Harold Vane at the State Insurance Commission.
Vane did not ask about Marsh's termination from Consolidated Fidelity. Instead, he formally asked Marsh to serve as a technical consultant to the prosecution's actuarial analysis team. They needed someone who understood the exact mechanics of the reinsurance reconciliation reports to explain the fraud to a grand jury. Marsh accepted the position immediately. It was the first professional role he had been offered in 2 weeks. It paid significantly less than his old salary at the life company, and it offered no corner office or pension plan, but he took it without a moment of hesitation. The numbers, he knew, would finally be allowed to speak.
Vivian Cross did not wait for Pruitt to act on his written threat of termination.
She drafted a 2-sentence resignation letter and submitted it to the Courier's personnel office. The Associated Press Bureau in Hartford, recognizing the sheer force of the reporter who had broken the city's largest scandal in a decade, offered her a full-time staff position the following week. She accepted. On her last day at the Courier, she walked into Pruitt's empty office. She did not leave a note. She simply placed her 2 spare stenographer's notebooks squarely in the center of his pristine desk, a silent monument to the work he had tried to bury, and walked out of the building for the last time.
The final piece of the pattern locked into place 3 days after the arrests. Margaret Dole, the niece of the first woman to die, read the comprehensively published story in the Sunday edition. She saw the details of the intercepted mail and the systematic suppression of complaints. She walked into her kitchen, opened the drawer beside her sink, and retrieved a piece of paper. She telephoned the Attorney General's office and asked to speak with Patricia Burrell. Dole reported, her voice shaking with a mixture of grief and vindication, that she still possessed the original carbon copy of her unanswered complaint letter, the exact same letter that Desmond Farwell had intercepted and believed he had destroyed 9 months ago. Burrell dispatched an investigator to Dole's home within the hour. The carbon copy, with its faded type and its desperate, prescient questions about the timing of the cancellation notice and her aunt's sudden illness, was carefully placed into a manila folder. It was formally entered into the state's growing mountain of evidence against Farwell and Norcott as Exhibit 41.
The ledger had provided the motive. The physician had provided the method. The actuary had provided the mathematics. But it was the carbon copy of a letter from a grieving niece, preserved in a kitchen drawer, that proved the company had known exactly what it was doing. The pattern was no longer a theory. It was a proof, bound in green cloth and sealed in state evidence, resting far outside the boundaries of normal variance.